Hey, Raza. How's it going?
Pretty good. How are you?
Great.
It's almost July 4th weekend.
Nice. Any plans?
Might just relax this time.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Go to some plays, go to some shows.
Plays and shows. Sounds pretty fun. So let's just go ahead and get started with your background. If you can just kind of share how, like, your entire journey from the time that you finished college and then how you ended up at Doordash.
Awesome. So in college, I was actually a mechanical engineer. And I really liked to build things when I was younger and used to play around with all the empty cardboard boxes that we had, and I used to build things. So decided to go with mechanical engineering. Came out of school and worked in more of a supply chain role that involved some type of mechanical engineering background. So I stayed at a defense company for a little bit of time. They moved me out here to California. When I got to California, I was like, wow, there's so many other opportunities too.
What made you stay in Mountain View, or like just be interested in Mountain View?
It was very close to work.
Uh-huh.
I didn't really know about the Bay Area in terms of what was in San Francisco, what was in Mountain View. I had about 2 weeks to get settled. So just chose Mountain View,
Nice.
walked down a street called Castro.
Oh, yeah, Castro Street.
It was by the Caltrain, and I was like,
Uh-huh.
hey, I can get to the city from here.
Nice.
So just ended up settling walking distance from downtown.
And then how did you like join Doordash? Did you interview at other different companies and then you ended up here?
Yeah.
Or is this your first company? Like what's the background?
Yeah. So I took a little break from working in defense, learned how to code, and we can talk about that later. And then I worked for a consultancy first. And I found that consultancy gave me a really good foundation, let me work on a lot of projects, small and large, different languages. And after that, I kind of applied to a couple of companies, and Doordash was one of them that reached back out. And I was really excited that they did.
Nice. Did you learn to code by yourself or what?
Yeah. So the first couple of months, I was first trying to figure out what I should learn in terms of mobile development. Should it be Android or iOS? Should it be web development? Should I learn more kind of back end? And I didn't really know. And I figured, hey, I had an iPhone. I wanted to play with what I built and figured that iOS was the way to go. And then what solidified it is I had a really good friend.
How long ago was this?
This was in 2016.
2016.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. So I had a really good friend that was a pretty senior engineer at Facebook that also did iOS, and I was like, he could be my mentor. He doesn't know it, but I would later on, as I grew as an engineer, send him a lot of questions, and he was really there for me.
Hold on. So let's talk about your thought process, because this is like a common theme that occurs to so many people, like, grads, self-taught developers and what have you. Like, they're trying to enter the industry and they're like, oh crap, there's like a million different frameworks, a million different fields. What was your thought process when you wanted to join or when you become an iOS developer?
Yeah. For me, it took a little bit of time and then became super clear. There are so many different fields, and I kind of grouped them into like mobile, front end, web, and back end. And how I decided was just with what I had. I had an iPhone. I really liked iPhones. I liked the way that they interacted with people. I liked the way that they designed their products. And then I also had kind of like a resource or a mentor that would help me along the way. And I've always been more of a product kind of guy. I enjoy being closer to the product, and I knew that I would be able to build something and play with it or show my friends. And that was really exciting. And that was very evident from the first app I built, which all it did was put mustaches on people. So it was funny, but I had a really good time, and I knew that was right.
Cool. And why didn't you become an Android developer? Why? Is it because you just had an iPhone or?
Yeah. So I never had an Android device. I still have never had an Android device. And so I think it would be very helpful. And now I've been reaching out to the Android team and trying to pair with them. So I can get that experience. I think as you grow more senior, it's very helpful to have both. But I think iOS was a great place to start.
Nice.
And it was something that was close to me.
So you just started by learning Swift, and then you said you have a mentor. And before we did this podcast, we talked about how one of the guys from YouTube, I think his YouTube channel is Let's Build That App or something.
Yeah.
So he was your mentor.
Yeah. So he's actually a very good friend now, but he was an in-person teacher. So before he started that channel, or very early on the days, he taught in person, and I got to learn from him.
Nice. Was this like some sort of training that he organized, or?
Yeah. So he was actually an instructor at one of the institutions that I attended.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. Awesome. And I'm assuming you went through like a lot of struggles when you were learning to code. Can you share some of the struggles?
Yeah. So I think I'll break that up into two parts. Okay. So the first part, kind of after I decided iOS was the way to go. I basically took online courses, and it started actually in Objective-C. That was more of a core language. Swift was still kind of on its way up, but a lot of the bigger companies all wanted Objective-C backgrounds. So I started learning Objective-C on my own. Did a couple of things, but it's challenging. And for me, I knew I needed something else. So I looked for some in-person instruction, and that lasted quite some time, about 2 months. And I remember the days people slept overnight. We spent days together working on projects. Sometimes you do things more through repetition to learn and then understand later. But you were like, how does this work? None of this makes sense. What is all this? What are delegates? And then through repetition, you start to form an understanding.
Interesting. So you went straight into Objective-C. That must be very scary.
Yeah.
There's like all kinds of pointers and brackets and all kind of, it's like a huge mess.
Yeah.
And that was your first programming language, or did you know any other programming languages?
So I think the perks to be doing an engineering degree is you see a little bit of MATLAB, you see a little bit of potentially Fortran. I'd seen a little bit of C++ and MATLAB.
So it wasn't like a completely new language, right? You had some exposure to other languages.
Right. Yeah, I had exposure to other languages, and I think the fundamental understanding of how to program, how the logic works, was there. The challenge about Objective-C is very verbose.
Yes.
So it's like I was nervous. Like I didn't understand the syntax. I couldn't memorize it. And it was just getting over that hurdle that really helped me. Yeah.
Interesting. So I want to talk about basically like a little bit of your experience at Bootcamp, and also like what your thoughts on for people that are deciding between going and completely switching their major to computer science, or like if they're very close to finishing the degree, like would going to a bootcamp make more sense? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah. So I have a couple of thoughts on that. I think the computer science degree is very helpful because it teaches you a lot of things. You learn about, among other things, you learn about compilers. You learn about how various kind of languages work together. You learn kind of the foundation of programming, and there's probably some other things you learn. Sometimes these degrees you take like electrical engineering classes, and you have a lot of that knowledge. I think for boot camps, they're more focused on kind of production skills. And iOS is an interesting point because iOS isn't taught in a lot of schools. It's not.
It's like a secondary course or like an elective or whatever. Right?
Yeah.
It's, even that is not very common.
Yeah. So you don't see a lot of people in iOS having this university education. Stanford has some really good courses, but you need to decide to take them. I think if you're doing a CS degree and you want to learn something specific, I think the bootcamp is a great way to like ramp your skills up. I think also if you don't have a CS degree, programming is very helpful in a lot of verticals, and it can be very fun. And the future of work, I think, involves some basic understanding of how to code, and I think bootcamps can really help you there.
Yeah, but did you ever feel like you weren't good enough compared to other engineers that do have CS degrees? Can you talk about like if you ever felt any imposter syndrome or anything like that, and how people can overcome it, right? Like especially if they're coming from a non-engineering background and then they learn to code by themselves and then they enter a room full of engineers that actually have some kind of engineering degree or STEM degree. Like how do you actually get over the imposter syndrome?
Right. Yeah, I think I have it I've had it, and I have it all the time, and I think I will continue to have it. But the other thing I see is that sometimes engineers with CS degrees have that too. So there's like so much that you can learn and that you can bring to like a meeting or a project that there are times where you do feel imposter syndrome. I think focusing on a few of the basics to start, for iOS specifically, maybe like networking, how views are set up and displayed. Some of those things can be really critical, and once you have a good understanding of those, you can start to build on other things like how to communicate with a backend engineer, or more about how to store securely on a device, or using core data or keychain, or I guess any of the various ways of storage. You want to focus on learning about storage in general, so you can talk about it with other people.
Right. When people want to like start interviewing, one of the biggest hurdles that prevents them from interviewing, or even prevents them from being successful at interviews, is they don't know if they're ready to start interviewing, right? Like I remember when I wanted to start interviewing for iOS roles, like I didn't know if I was ready. Like how do you actually know if you're ready? And like, are there any set of topics that if you master all of them, then like you're ready for sure? Or how do you know if you're ready?
How do you know if you're ready? So my best advice is to study a little bit. There are lots of resources online specifically for iOS interviews or any of the interviews that you're trying to do, and apply to a couple of companies. I think there's still a strong demand for software engineers and software developers. So you kind of head in and you get a feel for what the interview is like. How does it feel to be in an in-person whiteboarding interview? How does it feel to code in front of somebody else that's evaluating you? How does it feel to talk about engineering when you're just having a technical conversation? So I think getting the in-person experience is really helpful. If you want, I can recommend other ways that I think iOS engineers should prepare.
Please.
So if you have some time, I recommend a schedule. I think that's the best thing. Some consistency, and some things that you want to study in that period of time. So the first thing is the language.
Okay.
So
do you start with Objective-C or Swift?
I started with Objective-C and got really comfortable with Swift really quickly. Okay. And I think the main thing is to confirm what language they're going to interview in, or if the language you choose is acceptable in an interview. I remember one of my first interviews actually went in for an iOS developer job, and the questions were asked in C++. And while I got through, I didn't really prepare for that. And that's not something I asked. So that is the first piece of information: is make sure the language you're comfortable in is the language that the company is okay interviewing you in. The second is to know the core concepts of your language. So for iOS, it's like how the views work, as we discussed, how networking is done on iOS, how storage is done on iOS, and probably some common patterns. So you have
patterns, you mean like design patterns?
Yeah, design patterns. So you have like VIP, you have MVP, MVVM, and just being able to speak about that, and maybe even doing some code samples before, so that you can speak intelligently about the pros and cons. Outside of just iOS specific development, I would figure out how to use your language and apply them to algorithm questions.
They're like the worst.
Yeah, they are the worst. There's a really good book, Cracking the Code. It's pretty popular. Yeah. Actually, what I did was I took probably a quarter to half the questions in every chapter and just did them in Swift. Did them by hand, did them on the whiteboard, did them with other people, and just kind of got through the whole book. And you see things like arrays, dictionaries, trees. You see things like bit operations, and you kind of see everything from a more computer science level. Right.
So like I guess what you're saying is there's like 3 different fields that you have to really study. One is the iOS framework, like UI kit and whatever. Right. And then like you study the actual languages like Swift and Objective-C. And then you also learn some data structures and algorithms, and then learn how to solve the coding challenges in Swift or any other languages. What are the companies that you interviewed at? Do they always ask these algorithm questions, or are there just few companies that ask? Like, do you know what percentage of companies will ask you these algorithm questions if you're applying for an iOS job?
Yeah. So in almost all my interviews, and I've interviewed with larger companies that are more well-known, I've interviewed with smaller companies, it's almost been 50-50. So usually interviews will have kind of like after you get through the phone screen, after you get through maybe like a take home, you have an onsite, and the onsite's usually, most of the day, and you might have 4 to 6 interviews. And in that, in most of my experiences, 50% have been algorithm related, and about 50% have been platform specific. So they would be iOS specific questions. And I think that's a good balance, and it's a great motivator to study both the language and the algorithm.
Right. And what do you think about algorithm questions, including that in interviews? What are your thoughts on that?
So I think at the highest level, mobile engineers don't use them as much, but I do think it's very important to know, especially we do things very often like filter, map, reduce, compact map. We do things like local caching. So when you do those things, it's really helpful to quickly make a decision on which data structure to use and what the big O efficiency is for that.
Right. Yeah, it totally makes sense. I think that's one of the things that makes someone truly an exceptional engineer is understanding what's happening behind these APIs. Yeah. Like if you're just going to use like map and whatever and like have a for loop within a for loop within a for loop and create terrible code, right? Because you don't know what's happening behind the scenes. So it really helps to know like at least the basics of time and space complexity and how these different data structures work, like hash maps and whatnot. Right. Like a dictionary in Swift is basically just like a hash map, right? Or a hash table that is referred in other languages like C++ or whatever. One of the things I did was like recreate all of these different data structures from scratch. And believe me, like whoever's watching this, it really changes your perception, and it definitely helps you become a better engineer when you're actually coding, right? Like even though Swift is a much higher level language compared to other languages like C++, it really helps to know what's happening behind the scenes, right? Yep. So I think one of the interesting things that people can do is also learn like a low level language like C even, if they have time, obviously, and just review that, and that'll definitely like help them understand what's happening behind the scenes, like memory management. Yeah,
I recommend even reading a book over a night or a couple of nights, just getting the concept and seeing what's capable and how things are done at a lower level language, I think can really help you and can be very beneficial when learning kind of like Swift or even Objective-C. I feel like Swift in the beginning at least sat on top of Objective-C. So Objective-C would have been a good language to learn, but learning C or C++ would be very helpful.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. A lot of people nowadays, especially online, are like talking about how learning anything, like all these extra things is not really applicable to your day-to-day jobs and whatnot. But I disagree. I think it's great if they can. The more they learn, the better it is for them. Right. Is iOS development still something that's in high demand? Like, is it too late for people to become iOS developers?
Absolutely not. Not a chance. I think at least at this very moment in time, there's a huge shortage in the Bay Area, and I think across other places for iOS development. The number of iPhones is increasing, not only in the United States but other places in the world, and so everyone is looking for iOS developers, and I would say it's a great time to learn iOS development.
Nice. Yeah. Well, that's great to hear.
Yeah.
Will your job ever be extinct by React Native or any of these non-native frameworks?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So I think the larger companies and the companies that have been around mostly choose to use to use native, whether it's like Kotlin or Java or Swift or Objective-C, because there are advantages to that. New APIs that come out are available to you immediately, and you're working with the language that Apple provides versus some wrapper around that, and you have to kind of wait for the wrapper to be updated in some cases for you to have access to those APIs. Alternatively, I think a lot of the smaller companies choose to use React Native because they can develop for multiple platforms at the same time. So I think there will be opportunity for both, and there is opportunity for both. I think it's helpful if you know both, but I don't think it's a bad thing if you decide to focus on one or the other. It depends on what you're looking for. Yeah,
I remember back in 2014, there was this, even earlier than that, but I remember when I started learning it, like there's a huge hype with these frameworks, and like there was this thing called Ionic framework. I don't know if you've heard of it. But people are like, man, this thing is going to destroy all the iOS jobs. It's going to eliminate all the Android jobs. This is going to basically be the standard. But it turns out that wasn't necessarily the case. And I guess both could grow at the same time.
Right. Yeah.
Awesome. So can you talk about like building your resume? What people, because you come from a sort of a different background. Right. When you're just out of college or just finished a boot camp or whatever, like when you don't have anything in your experience section, all you have is like perhaps some other field that was not related to your iOS job. Right. Like what exactly do you put in your resume?
Right. Yeah. So I think there's two things to bring up. Even if you're applying for an engineering role, even if you are an engineer applying to a different role, there's one main thing. You'll always be working on part of a team, or you'll always be communicating with someone, whether it's the person that hired you, it's the team you work on, the organization you're under. At Doordash, we work within our teams, we work cross-functionally a lot. There are so many interactions. I think some of those soft skills are good to highlight.
Can you talk about some of these soft skills?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is communication.
Okay. How
do you communicate, and how can you bring that to wherever you're applying to make things more effective, more efficient? I think that's huge. I think other things relate to more organizational skills. How do you organize your projects, or how do you work with it under a timeline? So whether it's keeping diligent notes, or creating some spreadsheet for yourself, or figuring out how to get other people organized on a team. I think those are all very important skills, and it doesn't matter what you're doing. You can bring that to engineering. So let me talk about the second thing, personal projects.
Okay.
So that was how I got my first job.
Nice.
I think it was Apple Watch SDK just come out. I had heard a lot of people in San Francisco were getting tickets for riding their bikes with no lights at night. So basically, I figured out how to get a flashing light on Apple Watch, which exists now by default. It didn't before. And how to pair
Maybe
that.
Apple stole your idea.
Potentially. I'd like to think they did. And how to sync that with your iPhone. So both your iPhone could blink both white and red, and your Apple Watch could do the same, and that would help you keep safe on the streets.
Well, that's a great idea,
and not get tickets.
Wow.
So I just played around and got it to work. It was pretty bad code, but I think the company that ended up hiring me was really excited about the initiative I took and how hard it was, because there weren't that many docs out there at that point. But it was just something I thought was cool, and ended up building it, and they gave me a shot.
It's funny because a lot of people, including myself, just aren't sure if the project that they build is good enough to put it in the resume. Like, it just seems like it's such a small project, or it's such an easy project that anyone can potentially build.
Right.
Why should we even list it in the resume when it's so easy or so insignificant?
Right. So I think it's either like something you built on the side and something you're passionate about, versus probably not having anything on there. So I think building something is the first thing, but building something you're excited about brings that energy to the interview. Allows you to talk about it. You're excited about it. something that close to you. It doesn't need to be, all very shiny. It just needs to be something you're happy about and can talk about. It should be something that taught you something, whether you used it to help you learn a pattern, or whether you use the project to help you learn about views, or any of the things we talked about, networking. It doesn't matter what it is. As long as it was a learning experience, as long as you're passionate about it, I think that'll give you a pretty good opportunity in the interview.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Like one of the things I want to share is just the way that recruiters work. When they see the resume and they see like 5-6 projects, even if they're so insignificant, versus another resume that doesn't have any projects. Maybe they'll have like 2 projects. They'll just like glance over and see, oh, this guy has 5 projects, and then they'll give him a shot, right? It seems like it's not fair, but I just feel like it makes more sense to list whatever projects that they've built, even if they think it's insignificant, because it gives them a shot for sure.
Yeah. I think the first step is putting your best foot forward, and the best foot forward is kind of displaying the work that you've done. Yeah,
like have something in the resume, and like you said, instead of nothing, right? Yeah. You talked about very briefly about these design patterns. Can you talk about what architectural design patterns people should be aware of when they're applying? There's like MVC, there's MVVM, there's Viper, there's Clean Swift, VIP, and all kinds of frameworks. Yeah. What are the top 3 main frameworks that they should know? Design patterns that they should know?
What are the top 3 they should know? That's an interesting question. So the first one you should know is MVC. And the reason why you should know that is you probably shouldn't use that at kind of a production level at a larger company, and there are reasons for that. I think MVVM is a really good solid one to know, and there are variations of that where you can use coordinators and other things to kind of help that pattern. But I think that's a good separation of logic and a fairly easy pattern to pick up. Then you get into harder, more difficult patterns that involve newer frameworks. And the challenge there is that if you work at a larger company, maybe they haven't gotten there yet, or they haven't migrated their code there yet. So you have things like Swift UI, which is really awesome, but really probably better for side projects for you to pick that up. And then a little while later, some of the companies will be able to start implementing that in their code. So we talked about MVC, MVVM. I actually think Ribs is a good one.
The Uber one?
So
it looks pretty tough.
Yeah, it's pretty challenging. I had a chance to work on that pattern.
Nice.
And I found it really awesome. It really makes things easy in terms of kind of like allocation. You can throw things out when you're not using them. And it keeps things in memory pretty easily when you are using them, using coordinators.
There's so many features in Doordash app. You work in the Dasher app, right? So how do you go from thinking about a feature all the way to production?
Oh, man. I think that there are a few things I think about. So I think the first thing is, what are our release cycles? And from a production point of view, you really want to make sure you've planned your work so that it hits one of those release cycles. They're there for a reason. We have people that kind of shepherd the app into the App Store and allow all our users to kind of like get that app. But we want to make sure that app is fully tested and the app, for the most part, doesn't crash. And so we want to plan effectively for the project and give people enough time to review the code. So for larger projects, make sure the PR or the pull request is up a couple of days before the release or the branch is cut. So that that gives people enough time to review and leave comments, and gives you enough time to adjust those comments and to test anything else.
How many reviewers do we usually have before it gets through?
Yeah. So one review is pretty reasonable for smaller PRs. For larger PRs, we should have 2 reviews. And for the most part, there are a few reasons why we want that. So the first review is so that more people understand what's changing in the project. That visibility is very, very important, and we actually write tech specs that help with that. So if you need to reference why this change was made, you can go back to the documentation and check that out. The second thing is for larger PRs, we want to make sure we get more eyes on it, just to make sure everything has been reviewed, and we have different points of view on that review. So.
What are your tips on getting reviews and basically reviewing other people? Because I feel like there are so many people that lose opportunities on receiving good reviews. For example, they might just ask someone that they know for sure is going to give them an easy pass.
Right.
So like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So that brings up a good point. So the first thing on doing a review, I'll talk about that first. So the thing that I think about a lot is when you review something, you're responsible for the code as much as the person that wrote it. So I think if you take that in your thought process when you're reviewing, then it's a lot more important. And maybe you put a lot more effort into reviewing someone else's code. If you give it an approve and something happens, it's probably okay, but you're equally as responsible as the person that wrote it. So put that effort in and maybe set a time for yourself. For me, it's probably between 10 and 10:30 every morning at least. So when I look at the PRs that are open, that gives time to other people for the rest of the day, if they need to make any changes. It allows me to get some review done earlier in the day. To get other people to review your PRs, that's more fun. Bribes work well, so if you want to bring in donuts for other people, I think that's helpful. The other thing is make it easy for other people to review. If you have a large feature, break it up into small chunks that don't require trying to figure out what's going on. Make it straightforward. Change a couple of files. Don't put up 500-line PRs at once. Put up much smaller PRs and put them in a feature branch. And then the feature branch, you can say, hey, each one of these smaller PRs have been reviewed and approved. This feature is just going in all at once, but everything's been approved.
That's a very good idea. And I should start doing that.
And I think over time, that was a lesson learned, and you kind of learn how big of a PR is okay. But that's helped, and really making things clear. There's a lot of context you might have on a feature, but really putting that in your pull request and letting people know what's going on would be very helpful.
Nice. Is Swift UI is Swift UI the answer to all of the problems as far as building the views, or is it too early to say?
I think it's a little too early to say. I think it's awesome, and I think people should certainly explore it on the side or on personal projects. I think it'll be a little while before industry is able to pick that up full force. But I do think it's interesting and it's new. And Apple, as usual, didn't give many hints beforehand, and they just came out with it. So
yeah, that's Apple's way of doing things.
Yeah.
So while we're in the topic, like as we progress in our career, we'll find new technologies, new languages, new ways of doing things. And, who knows, like maybe one day iOS job will be completely eliminated. You never know, right? What are your tips for constantly staying in demand and making sure that you have a solid career ahead of you? It's not like if you're a physician, right? Or if you're in a different profession, after 40 years or 50 years of experience, you are pretty much very solid in your life. But in software development world, that's not the case. You constantly have to keep on learning.
Right.
So what are your thoughts on that, and any tips that you'd like to share?
Sure. So I think on the continuous learning piece, there's one thing in engineering, and it's to make a balance or create a balance on learning more about what you're doing currently, and getting deeper and a deeper understanding of what you're doing, and trying out new things like Swift UI. So it's kind of straddling that line of what do I do, and it's maybe 50% getting deeper knowledge of what you're doing, and what's going on underneath, that helps kind of you become indispensable. And then the other side is learning what's new and what's the hottest thing that has just come out. So you can talk about it, but also there are other places that will implement that. And if you decide to look around, you have a little bit of both, and that brings a lot to the table. In terms of kind of staying relevant, networking. Yeah. Don't forget about kind of the other skills. Continue to, go to meetups or other technical talks. Keep up with people in the industry, whether you use Twitter or whether you use, some other, maybe there are some Facebook groups that are pretty helpful, or Reddit groups. Just keeping connected to people in your industry, because as the industry evolves and one type of job might go away, other types of jobs will pop up, and you want to see how you can use your experience to kind of track that.
Yeah, for sure. It's one of the scariest thoughts that a lot of people have, is just keeping up with these technologies. But like you said, attending all these meetups and just networking is a sure way to keep yourself updated with all these new technologies.
Right.
Before you have to learn it, right? You it's a lot better to learn it before you're forced to learn it. Right. So I guess before we close, can you talk about the way that you learn new things? And it would be really nice if you can talk about it with specific examples, and just like how do you actually go about learning new things and your process for doing that?
Yeah. So for me, let me think about this for a second. What is something I learned recently that I really enjoyed? I can definitely talk about core data. So my first time implementing core data actually had an iCloud syncing bug. Okay. Very interesting. Writing to core data and reading from core data, at some point, some data got lost. So the way I learn is when I have a problem that I need to solve, I want to go and learn about it. And the way I do that is I watch videos. So for me, that works. I'll watch maybe 3 or 4 videos, 10, 20 minutes long, trying to figure out how different people attack a problem, because I think it's less about how the implementation is, but more about the steps they took to understand and attack the problem versus the implementation solution. After that, I think documentation has been getting better. So both Apple's documentation, but also there's Stack Overflow, and there's other places that you can go to kind of understand how people have implemented a solution, or what possibilities there are on implementing a solution, and then trying it out. Open a Playground, which is a great invention by Apple. Open up a Playground. It's not as bulky. It's not a whole project. It's, just a single place where you can mess around, and copy paste and see what happens. And I think that's a great sequence to try and see if something works, or try and figure out if this is even the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things that really helps people learn things very fast, is just keep on going and then stumble across a problem and then just figure out how to solve it. That's so much better than just opening up books and then reading things from the beginning and going sequentially. At least for me, and I'm assuming for yourself as well, it's so much easier to learn that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you so much for doing this podcast.
Yeah, that was fun.
And I hope that this was beneficial to whoever's listening. And thank you.
Good luck. Yeah.